You're looking at a marriage certificate that should never have existed. Faded, brittle, locked away in the Louisiana State Archives, yet still screaming a name drenched in blood. Jeremiah Aldrich. And beneath his signature, Celeste. Not a wife, not even a woman in the law's eyes, just one word: property. But here, where the nightmare begins. Because within months of this twisted union in March 1854, 13 people were dead. 13. And whispers spread that this wasn't chance, but part of a conspiracy so terrifying, so untouchable that the authorities buried it to protect Louisiana's most powerful families. What happened next at Willowbrook Plantation was darker than anything the violence-hardened South had ever seen. Torture, betrayal, revenge so precise it looked like the devil himself had drawn up the plans. And trust me, if you think this sounds disturbing already, you haven't heard the real twist yet. But before we rip the mask off Jeremiah Aldrich's secret world, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from, because this is a journey you'll want the lights on for. Now let me drag you back to a time when honor was currency, betrayal was a death sentence, and broken trust could destroy a man in ways worse than the grave. To understand this cursed marriage, we have to rewind 15 years into the swampy, mosquito-choked backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, a place where fortunes weren't built on dreams, but on flesh, where blood money flowed faster than the muddy river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't born into power. No, he crawled toward it. Son of a failed Kentucky farmer, he stumbled into New Orleans in 1839 with nothing but burning ambition and an appetite for the one trade that even high society whispered about in shame: human lives. The old Creole aristocrats cloaked themselves in sugar and cotton, pretending their riches weren't soaked in pain. But Jeremiah, he didn't care about appearances, and in the sweltering summer of 1840, he made a choice that would seal his fate forever, joining forces with Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, men as ruthless as him, men who knew how to make a fortune off suffering. And that's when the clock started ticking. Every deal, every betrayal, every body buried in the Delta mud pushed Jeremiah closer to the one decision that would ignite the deadliest chain reaction Louisiana had ever seen. Because the marriage, the deaths, the conspiracy, that was just the beginning. The biggest twist hasn't even come yet. Desperation collided with ambition, and the result was a pact made in shadows. Marcus Devo, the youngest son of a sugar dynasty on the verge of collapse, needed cash to stop creditors from ripping apart his family's legacy. Samuel Rochelle, once a proud ship captain, now broken by yellow fever and ruin, carried something far more valuable than money: the secret maps of the Caribbean's black market slave routes. And then there was Jeremiah Aldrich, the man with nothing to lose, nothing to fear, and everything to gain. Together, they birthed a monster. They called it the Delta Trading Company. Operating from a warehouse on the ragged outskirts of New Orleans, where law vanished like mist on the river, their empire grew in the shadows. Legitimate traders sold bodies with papers, titles, and health certificates. But Aldrich and his partners, they dealt in ghosts. They called it recovery services, a polite mask for horror. They bought back escaped slaves from corrupt bounty hunters. They kidnapped free black men and women off the streets, turning lives into ledgers. And most lucratively of all, they smuggled human cargo from ships that still crossed the Atlantic, illegal vessels slipping through the night, defying the international ban that was supposed to end the trade forever. The profits, astronomical, because they didn't waste a dime on health, housing, or even survival. To them, flesh was cheaper than tools, and for 3 years the blood money poured in. Devo used his cut to resurrect his family's plantation, transforming it into one of the most powerful sugar dynasties in St. Charles Parish. Rochelle bought a fleet of riverboats and reinvented himself as a respected shipping magnate. And Jeremiah Aldrich, he claimed his throne. 40 miles upriver, he purchased Willowbrook Plantation, a sprawling cotton estate crowned with a grand colonial mansion. To Louisiana's elite, it was proof Aldrich had arrived. But success breeds arrogance, and arrogance attracts hunters. By the spring of 1843, whispers began to circle. Federal marshals were probing the Gulf Coast, tracking illegal slave networks. Questions were being asked, shipping records examined, and worst of all, survivors, men and women who had slipped free of Aldrich's grip, were talking. Panic surged. Their empire wasn't invincible, it was bleeding. The three men gathered in secret, candlelight flickering against their faces, every shadow in the room heavy with suspicion. Because someone was leaking information. Someone close. And if the marshals closed in, the Delta Trading Company wouldn't just collapse, they'd all hang for it. And this meeting in 1843, is where the cracks began to spread. Cracks that would eventually lead to a cursed marriage, 13 deaths, and a reckoning no one at Willowbrook Plantation could escape. The clock was already ticking. An emergency session was called inside Aldrich's brand new study at Willowbrook. The room was lined with leather-bound books he couldn't even read, and oil portraits of ancestors who weren't even his. But what really hung in the air wasn't history. It was dread. Three men, one empire of human misery, and the crushing realization that it was all about to collapse. Devo was the first to break. Jittery, sweating, his voice cracked as he urged, "We end this now. Burn the ledgers, cut ties, walk away before the marshals close in." Rochelle leaned back, calmer, the saltwater pragmatism of a sailor still in his bones. He wanted patience, shift the money offshore, wait for the heat to pass, live to fight another day. But Jeremiah Aldrich, his solution wasn't survival, it was annihilation. Because while the others argued, Aldrich was already writing their death warrant in his head. Cold, calculated. He wouldn't just dissolve the company, he'd erase his partners forever, then bury the truth under a staged bloodbath so convincing it would look like they destroyed each other. The plan was monstrous in its simplicity. Murder both men, forge the story of a violent money dispute, and emerge as the sole survivor of a tragic business fallout. Their secrets, buried. Their fortune, his. And so, on a suffocating June night in 1843, Aldrich put his plan into motion. The warehouse where their empire had thrived for 3 years would become its tomb. By day, it was just another rotting husk in the port district, but Aldrich chose it for a reason. After dark, it was abandoned, and within weeks, it was scheduled for demolition. Perfect, no witnesses, no trace. He arrived first. Hidden in his coat was a loaded pistol gleaming with deadly intent. Tucked in his boot, a razor-sharp skinning knife waiting for its moment. The order of execution was set in his mind. Devo would fall first, then Rochelle. And with them gone, he'd stage the scene like a duel gone wrong, an empire destroyed by greed, not by his hand. Aldrich had even gone one step further. He had bribed 3 dockworkers to act as false witnesses, ready to swear they'd seen Devo and Rochelle fighting bitterly over missing money earlier that very day. So when Devo and Rochelle walked into that warehouse, they saw nothing unusual. Just Aldrich, seated calmly at the familiar planning table. A bottle of expensive whiskey waited between them. Three glasses gleamed in the lamplight, balanced on stacks of ledgers and shipping documents. The air was thick with heat, and for a moment everything felt normal. Conversation flowed, business as usual. Devo even cracked a nervous smile as he spoke. But none of them knew that within minutes, blood would stain those ledgers forever. The countdown had begun. The meeting began like any other. Ledgers open, glasses clinking, and Rochelle carefully mapping out their escape plan. He talked of Havana, of offshore banks beyond the reach of U.S. law, a safe haven for their empire's blood money. But Aldrich wasn't listening. Not really. His mind was locked on one thing, their hidden reserves. So with the whiskey flowing, he started to probe. Where was the cash stashed? Which banks held their accounts? Which safe houses still brimmed with gold? And that's when Rochelle's instincts kicked in. Years at sea had sharpened him like a blade. He noticed the way Aldrich's eyes darted, never meeting theirs. The way his hand hovered again and again near the pocket of his coat. The tremor in his voice every time he pressed them for account numbers. Something was wrong. So Rochelle called it. We reconvene tomorrow with lawyers present. And in that instant, Aldrich knew the window had slammed shut. It was now or never. The gun came out fast, gleaming under the lantern light. One deafening shot cracked through the warehouse like thunder. Devo didn't even have time to scream. The bullet punched into his chest, sending him tumbling back, his white shirt blooming crimson as his wide eyes froze in betrayal. But Rochelle, he wasn't going down so easy. With the reflex of a fighter who had survived mutinies and storms, he upended the heavy oak table, splintering glass and whiskey across the floor. He lunged at Aldrich, a jagged bottle in his fist, and slashed deep across Jeremiah's face. The cut ripped his cheek open, carving the scar that would brand him for the rest of his life. What followed was chaos, pure, unhinged chaos. They tore through crates of documents, sent ledgers flying into the shadows, blood streaking across every surface. Rochelle fought like a man who knew the truth. Aldrich was the executioner, and this fight was his only chance to die with honor. 10 minutes of hell, steel clashing, fists pounding, glass shattering, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and blood. Aldrich's knife flashed in the lamplight, and Rochelle's hands clawed desperately, refusing to surrender. But time is merciless. Rochelle was 53, his strength waning, his body slowing. And Aldrich, driven by greed, by rage, by the sheer will to dominate, finally forced the blade home. He plunged it deep into Rochelle's stomach, twisting upward until the man's breath rattled with death. But Rochelle didn't die silent. With his final, blood-soaked gasp, he choked out words that froze Aldrich's veins. My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay. Aldrich sneered, dismissing it as the ravings of a dying man. But what he didn't know, the truth that would one day come crashing back into his life, was that Rochelle's warning wasn't just a curse. It was a prophecy, and the countdown to vengeance had already begun. Imagine walking into a warehouse where two men are already dead, and the killer is standing right in front of you pretending he's the victim. That's exactly what Aldrich pulled off. For 4 straight hours, he staged the perfect crime scene. He bent Devo's body into the position of a man reaching for a gun, shoved a bloody knife into Rochelle's lifeless hand, and carved fake defensive wounds into the corpse to make it look like they had killed each other. And he didn't stop there. He scattered money across the floor, smashed open the office safe, and even sliced up his own arm so police would believe he barely survived. By the time investigators arrived, the scene screamed one story: two partners fighting over money until they destroyed each other, and Aldridge, just the unlucky survivor. But here's the twist. He'd already hired fake witnesses. A dock worker swore he heard shouting and gunshots. Others testified that Rochelle and Devo had been fighting earlier about missing cash. Piece by piece, Aldridge's lie became the official truth. Police, desperate to clear cases in a crime-ridden New Orleans, didn't bother digging deeper. Within days, the report was filed. Devo and Rochelle murdered each other in a business dispute. Aldridge barely escaped. Case closed. And just when you think it couldn't get darker, Aldridge leveled the warehouse, wiping out every shred of evidence. Then, with forged documents in hand, he convinced the banks that he alone was the rightful heir to the company. Overnight, the poor plantation owner became a wealthy, respected shipping magnate. What nobody knew was that he had just built his empire on blood. For a moment, it looked like Aldrich had won. He drained every account, every safe, every stash his murdered partners left behind. Nearly $40,000 in 1843, a fortune worth over $1 million today. Overnight, he transformed himself from a suspicious outsider into a respected Louisiana gentleman, cloaked in the wealth of the men he betrayed. But in his arrogance, Aldrich overlooked one thing: the dead don't always stay buried. He forgot the families, and that mistake would doom him. Because while Aldrich celebrated his rise, two shadows were already forming, relatives who refused to accept the lie. And their revenge wouldn't just be swift. It would be so calculated, so merciless, that Aldrich would one day beg for death. The first shadow was Philippe Devo, just 22 when his brother Marcus was killed. But unlike the reckless men of his family, Philippe was patient, cold, and frighteningly intelligent. He had something Aldrich didn't know about: records, coded ledgers, shipping manifests, hidden correspondence with corrupt officials, evidence that could burn Aldrich's entire empire to the ground. And here's the twist. Philippe never trusted Aldrich to begin with. Even before the murders, he was already digging, uncovering cracks in Aldrich's past, fake histories, missing money, signs of a man far more dangerous than just a greedy partner. So when Marcus was found dead in that staged business dispute, Philippe's grief didn't come in tears. It came in the form of cold fury. He knew the official story was a lie. His brother was cautious, too cautious to start a fight. Rochelle wasn't reckless either. The scene didn't add up, unless Aldrich had written it himself. That's when Philippe made a vow. Aldrich thought he had erased the past, but Philippe was going to make sure the past came back to destroy him. And this was only the beginning. Philippe didn't grieve like a son. He investigated like a man who had nothing left to lose. The warehouse mystery didn't sit right in his bones. The crooked angles of Aldrich's story, the money mentioned that had already been moved, the tiny details only someone close to the accounts would know to lie about. Philippe could smell a setup. Within days of the funeral, he was at work. He used every contact left from his brother's shadowy network: dockworkers who whispered in alleys, clerks who kept secrets for the right coin, even cops who could be bent with a few discreet payments. He interviewed men who remembered footsteps outside the warehouse, cross-checked shipping manifests, and pried into ledgers nobody else dared touch. Piece by piece, the lie unraveled. The scene had been staged. Witnesses had been bought. Documents had been scrubbed. Most damning, Aldrich had begun emptying accounts within hours of the killings. Too fast for an honest man, perfect timing for a planned grab. But while Philippe tore at the rope of lies with brute force, Henry Rochelle worked like a surgeon. 24 and sharper than his age let on, Henry combined his father's maritime smarts with legal training and banking know-how. He'd spent years inside New Orleans back rooms, banks, shipping houses, clerks' offices, making friends who whispered when the ledger was heavy and quiet when the ledger was clean. He followed paper trails where Philip followed people. Henry's accounting was brutal and specific. He traced transfers, property deeds, and shipping invoices until the picture was undeniable. Aldrich hadn't taken tens of thousands. He'd taken over $60,000 in cash, land, and investments. Money that represented 3 years of illegal profit built on the misery of hundreds. That figure, 60 grand, wasn't just theft. It was a mountain of motive. But here's the part that makes this story poisonous. Henry didn't want a headline. He didn't want a courthouse theater jammed with bribed judges and bought jurors. He wanted Aldrich to bleed in a way the law couldn't easily fix. While Philip hunted for direct proof to hang the man, Henry began setting a trap that used Aldrich's greatest weakness, his greed, against him. He mapped how banks could be cornered, how creditors and regulators could be nudged, how property deeds could be contested and titles peeled away like paint. He started planting seeds, anonymous tips, forged rumors of insolvency, quiet legal filings that would choke Aldrich's cash flow and force his enemies to circle. Two paths, one brutal force, one surgical ruin. Both men were patient, both men were precise, and both were sharpening the exact instruments that would one day cut Aldrich's world to ribbons. The clock was no longer on Aldrich's side. He had bought himself a fortress built on blood, and now two very different storms were forming on opposite horizons, each one set to tear that fortress down. But which storm would strike first? And would Aldrich see it coming before everything he'd stolen was taken back? The next move was coming, and when it landed, it wouldn't just ruin a man, it would rewrite the price of his sins. It began with a handshake in the shadows of the French Quarter. Fall, 1844. Philippe Deveau slid into a quiet corner of a restaurant, carrying ledgers thick with secrets. Across the table sat Henry Rochelle, armed with paper trails that could collapse empires. Neither man knew what to expect until they realized their skills fit together like lock and key. In that moment, grief turned into strategy. By spring of 1845, their private hunts for revenge fused into something far bigger, a conspiracy sharpened with patience, precision, and the exact same weapons Aldrich had used: betrayal, manipulation, and violence cloaked in respectability. Only this time it wouldn't be sloppy, desperate brutality. It would be slow, surgical destruction. Phase 1: Infiltration. Philip played the long game. Using what was left of his family's social standing, he slipped into Aldrich's world: gentlemen's clubs, political galas, smoky rooms where cigars burned and secrets spilled. He laughed at Aldrich's jokes, drank at his table, and played the part of harmless acquaintance. But behind every smile he studied Aldrich's patterns, his flaws, and, most importantly, his weaknesses. While Philip gathered whispers, Henry hunted numbers. In the vaults and ledgers of New Orleans, he dissected Aldrich's empire. The wealthy planter wasn't sitting on solid gold, he was standing on rotten stilts, risky loans, leveraged land, shiny profits masking crushing liabilities. It was all one bad season away from collapse, and then Henry struck gold. Aldrich had a secret addiction, a hunger that bled him dry. He gambled big. High-stakes poker, horse races, nights where he lost thousands he didn't have. Each loss drove him deeper into debt. Each debt forced him to mortgage his future. That weakness was the crack in his armor, the perfect opening. By 1848, the trap was almost ready. Aldrich thought he was winning at the tables. What he didn't know, the real game had already begun, and the dealers weren't wearing cards, they were wearing the faces of the men whose families he had destroyed. And once the first card fell, the rest of his empire would come crashing down. National Bank of New Orleans, the very bank that held the lifeline of Aldrich's empire, the mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From inside the vaults, Henry became the invisible hand tightening the noose. Interest rates, raised just enough to sting. Loan renewals, structured to choke cash flow during the worst planting seasons. Slowly, methodically, Aldrich's financial fortress was being hollowed out from the inside. Meanwhile, Philip sharpened the other blade. He slipped into the world of New Orleans, most ruthless gambling dens, rooms thick with cigar smoke, gold on the table, knives under the floorboards. With bribes and whispered promises, he convinced the operators to set the trap. Aldrich was invited to exclusive tables, games where the stakes soared and the cards weren't dealt by chance. They were dealt by design. Each lucky opponent was in on it. Each hand Aldrich played dug him deeper. The beauty of their revenge was its patience. No dramatic gunfights, no reckless confrontation, just slow, invisible destruction. Every loan crushed him a little more. Every gambling loss pushed him closer to despair. Every desperate investment turned poison in his hands. By 1851, the numbers told the story. Aldrich's debts had ballooned to nearly $30,000, a sum so massive it consumed nearly all of Willowbrook's profits just to pay interest. Land was slipping through his fingers, sold off in desperation to cover losses, and whispers began to spread through Louisiana's planter elite. Maybe Aldrich wasn't the titan he pretended to be. Maybe Willowbrook was rotting from within. But the money wasn't the real prize. Philip and Henry weren't in this just to bankrupt him. No, they wanted something darker. They wanted Aldrich to feel what their fathers had felt, the suffocating terror of knowing the end was coming, the humiliation of watching everything he built collapse in front of him. This wasn't about revenge through numbers. It was about revenge through fear. And Aldrich had no idea that the ruin eating at his fortune was only the beginning. The real punishment was still waiting in the shadows. Imagine planning revenge so dark, so ruthless, that death itself would feel like mercy. That's exactly what Philip and Henry were about to unleash on Jeremiah Aldrich. Their plan wasn't just to bankrupt him. No, they wanted to break him, body and soul, until every shred of pride he clung to turned into ash. But here's the twist. They wouldn't use weapons, armies, or open rebellion. They would use Aldrich's worst nightmare, the very people he enslaved. Every plantation owner lived in fear of rebellion, and Aldrich was no different. Henry knew they could exploit that terror, but in a way no one saw coming. Instead of sparking bloodshed, they plotted something far more insidious. Aldrich would be forced into the ultimate humiliation, marriage to one of the women he enslaved. A union so degrading, so socially catastrophic, that it would annihilate his reputation forever. And once it happened, there would be no way for him to escape. But the question was, who would be chosen? Months of silent observation led them to one woman whose presence alone could shatter Aldrich's world, Celeste. At first glance, Celeste was simply the plantation's head cook, a large woman of 38 years. But to Philip and Henry, she was perfect. Why? Because behind her calm efficiency burned something Aldrich never recognized: raw, unfiltered hatred. She had been ripped from her husband and children years earlier, sold like property into Aldrich's hands, and ever since, she had carried a cold fury that never dimmed. Unlike others who masked their true feelings, Celeste made no attempt to hide her contempt. She didn't need to shout or resist. Her eyes alone told the story, a hatred so deep it could devour a man. And now, Philip and Henry were about to weaponize that hatred into Aldrich's ultimate destruction. 7 years. That's how long Celeste had lived with the crushing weight of loss. 7 years since Aldrich ripped her family apart and sold her children to strangers across different states. He didn't have to. He could have bought them all. But Aldrich, in his cold arrogance, decided her children were unnecessary mouths to feed. When Celeste begged him to at least keep her youngest, her 10-year-old daughter, Aldrich laughed in her face. "I run a plantation, not an orphanage," he sneered. That moment branded itself into her soul like fire. And so, for 7 long years, Celeste cooked banquets for the man who destroyed her life, serving him delicacies she could never taste, living on scraps while her children starved in unknown corners of the South. Every time Aldrich raised a glass of wine, she remembered the family he had torn from her. But she saw things no one else did. She scrubbed blood from his shirts after those mysterious midnight trips. She watched him burn letters and documents in the kitchen fireplace, desperately trying to cover the trail of his collapsing empire. She noticed his medicine bottles, his weak stomach, his obsessive routines, his growing paranoia. Celeste had memorized it all, and that knowledge, every flaw, every fear, made her more than a survivor. It made her the ultimate weapon. Philip and Henry knew they had found their key, but contacting her was a deadly risk. Speaking directly with an enslaved woman could expose their entire plot. So they moved carefully, using trusted intermediaries, free people of color working in New Orleans markets. They built a secret channel to Celeste. At first it was small, a little money here, a casual question there, but the information she gave back, explosive. She didn't just know Aldrich's daily routines, she knew his secrets better than anyone alive. And with each whispered detail she revealed, Philip and Henry realized something shocking. Celeste wasn't just willing to talk, she was ready to destroy him. They weren't just recruiting a conspirator. They'd found a co-conspirator with a grudge that burned hotter than theirs. Celeste had been waging her own small war for years, tiny sabotages that looked like accidents, a meal just salty enough to rip his stomach open, a favorite dish broken in his presence, a rumor whispered at dusk that his cash was gone, little cuts that made sleep impossible and trust vanish. She'd been softening him up without anyone ever being able to prove it. When Philip and Henry finally stepped out of the shadows and revealed everything, the murders, the stolen money, the plans, Celeste didn't hesitate. She didn't bargain with vengeance. She demanded one thing: freedom and a path north to Canada and the chance to find her children. They agreed without pause. They knew they'd found more than a weapon. They'd found a soul who wanted justice as much as they did. Over months, the strategy became a machine. Aldrich would be kneecapped financially, herded into humiliation, and then faced with an impossible choice that would sap the last shreds of his pride: marry Celeste or watch his creditors tear him limb from legal limb. The marriage, presented as a desperate legal maneuver, would humiliate him publicly, strip him of social currency, and most dangerously, put Celeste in the position to exact the slow retribution they all craved. Not a quick, sensational death, but a lingering fall from grace that would let him experience the same helpless terror he had inflicted on others. They never talked about gore in detail. This was theater of power, not a crude lynching. The cruelty lay in the optics: a planter forced into a union that would make him a joke in drawing rooms and a pariah at parties, so exposed that no ally could touch him. And once he was legally bound to Celeste, the legal levers would shift, property claims could be made, and the last lines of defense Aldrich thought he would begin to snap. Timing was everything. The whole structure depended on a single, perfect moment when Aldrich would be isolated, flailing, and willing to clutch at any offer that promised salvation. That moment arrived like a loaded die. Early 1854, when word reached Henry that Aldrich planned to risk everything at a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, one of those nights where men tried to buy back their futures with cards and fool's luck. It was the opening they'd been waiting for. A gambler on the ropes, a public spectacle, a crowd full of possible witnesses, and a man desperate enough to say yes to the most humiliating bargain. Philip and Henry leaned in. Celeste readied herself. The trap was set to snap shut. But here's the thing. In games like this, the first move is never the last. The biggest twist hadn't come yet. Aldrich thought the worst thing he'd face was losing his fortune. He had no idea the next choice would cost him more than money, would cost him his name, his safety, and everything he'd ever called honor. In just a few scenes from now, under the gaslight of a New Orleans night, Aldrich would be presented with the ultimatum that would break him, or break them. The cards were about to be dealt. The room held its breath. The countdown began. The warehouse didn't just smell of whiskey and sweat. It smelled like desperation. This was no ordinary card game. This was an execution disguised as poker, and Jeremiah Aldrich had walked straight into the gallows. He pushed through the fog-heavy streets clutching his last hope, a leather satchel stuffed with $8,000, money wrung from the bones of his plantation, slaves sold, equipment pawned, personal belongings stripped away. Everything he was, everything he had left was in that bag. The warehouse swallowed him whole. Inside, the gas lamps flickered against the haze, casting shadows that moved like ghosts across the walls. The table was waiting. The cards were stacked. The men, Philip's men, were smiling wolves dressed as gamblers. 5-card stud, stakes starting at $500 a hand. That first deal slapped like thunder. Aldrich's hands trembled, but luck teased him. Small wins, trickling just enough hope into his veins to make him believe the night could still save him. He laughed too loud. He drank too fast. And as the whiskey blurred his mind, the bets climbed higher. By midnight, half his fortune was gone. The satchel, once swollen with bills, sagged like an open wound. But Aldrich couldn't walk away. He wasn't just gambling money. He was gambling his survival. Every hand was a rope pulling tighter around his throat, and still he leaned in. The other players, all conspirators, kept feeding him just enough victories to keep him chained to the table. Hand after hand, the pot grew. His eyes burned with fever. His breaths came faster. And then, just after 2:00 a.m., it happened. The cards hit the table, 2 kings showing. His pulse exploded. This was it, his miracle. The hand that could claw him back from the abyss. If the hidden cards fell right, he'd have a full house. Enough to wipe out losses. Enough to save Willowbrook. Enough to crawl out of the grave. But what Aldrich didn't see, what no gambler ever wants to see, was that the trap had already closed. Because that hand wasn't a miracle, it was a coffin lid. And the next card, the one about to turn over under that choking fog, that was the nail that would seal it shut. The room leaned in. The fog pressed against the windows. Aldrich gripped the table so hard his knuckles turned bone white. The final card was sliding across the felt. And when it flipped, nothing would ever be the same. The final pot sat in the center of the table like a loaded gun. Aldrich shoved in his last $3,000, every penny he had left, and leaned forward with wild, bloodshot eyes. His kings flashed across the felt. His chest pounded. This was it, his last stand. But the other players weren't gamblers tonight, they were executioners, and the cards they laid down cut through Aldrich's hope like a knife. A full house, stronger, final, fatal. The room spun. His satchel was gone. His fortune was gone. His plantation, his power, his very name gone. Aldrich just sat there, a hollow man staring at the felt where his last shred of hope had just dissolved into smoke. The other players rose, one by one, disappearing into the mist outside the warehouse. All except one. The man who had taken everything. A stranger with cold, dead eyes who stacked his winnings with surgical precision. For a long, unbearable silence, the stranger just studied him, like a scientist watching something squirm under glass. Then finally he spoke. "Mr. Aldrich, we need to discuss your obligations." The voice was calm, measured, but it carried a faint French accent that gnawed at Aldrich's memory. "These gentlemen you've been playing against," the stranger continued, "are not merely gamblers, they represent interests. Interests that have been very patient with your failures, but patience, like luck," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, "always runs out." And then from the shadows at the edge of the warehouse, another figure stepped forward. The flickering gaslight caught his face, and Aldrich's blood froze solid. The resemblance was unmistakable. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," the man said, his voice sharp and venomous. "Perhaps because you have." He stepped closer, the light painting his features. "My name is Philip Devo, and you knew my older brother Marcus, didn't you? In fact, you were the last man to see him alive." The word stabbed deeper than any blade. 11 years peeled away in an instant, dragging Aldrich back to that night, to Marcus Devo's eyes, wide, shocked, and burning with betrayal, as the bullet tore through him. The warehouse, once thick with smoke and sweat, now felt colder than a tomb. Aldrich's hands trembled, his mouth dried to sand. And in that moment he understood, this wasn't a game, it was a reckoning. Because Philip wasn't alone. Henry Rochelle was already waiting in the dark. From the shadows, another figure stepped forward. His presence closed the trap, forming a triangle of accusers with Aldrich caught at its center like prey. Henry Rochelle, the son of Samuel, the boy Aldrich thought he had erased with a bullet all those years ago, now a man, eyes blazing with the same fire his father carried to the grave. "My father always said you were clever, Mr. Aldrich." Henry's voice cut through the smoky air, low and merciless. "Clever enough to murder two men, clever enough to steal their life's work, but not clever enough to realize that dead men sometimes leave behind sons, sons who remember every story, every betrayal, and every name." The warehouse fell into suffocating silence. Only the distant groan of a foghorn rolled across the Mississippi night, echoing like a funeral bell. Aldrich sat frozen, his breath ragged, his eyes darting between the men who had spent over a decade weaving this snare. He clawed through his mind for an escape route, but there was none. He was alone, penniless, and invisible to the world outside. If he vanished tonight, the river would carry his secret away forever. Philip slid into the chair across from him, his movements calm, deliberate, surgical. He leaned forward, his voice venom wrapped in velvet. "We know everything, Jeremiah, everything. The Delta Trading Company, the illegal slave shipments, the warehouse where you butchered our fathers like cattle, the forged documents, the bribed witnesses, the stolen fortunes you turned into Willowbrook Plantation. You've built your empire on corpses, Aldrich, and we've spent 11 years digging them back up." Henry circled closer, a leather folder in his hands. He opened it with the precision of a hangman tightening a noose and spread its contents across the poker table. "These," he said coldly, "are copies of every transaction you ever made since 1843, bank records, stolen estates, property transfers you thought erased, even letters from the very officials who helped bury your crimes, officials who now fear us more than they fear you." Aldrich's eyes widened. His stomach dropped. He recognized the ink, the seals, his own handwriting staring back at him like ghosts he thought he had burned to ash years ago. And then came the final blow: sworn statements. Witnesses, dockworkers, clerks, officers, people who had seen pieces of the puzzle, silent for years until now. The weight of it pressed down like chains. It wasn't just vengeance, it was a verdict. Inside the fog-choked warehouse, time itself felt frozen. For 11 long years, Jeremiah Aldrich had built his empire on blood and lies. But tonight, under the harsh glow of a single swinging lamp, the trap finally snapped shut. Philip and Henry didn't just walk in. They emerged from opposite ends like hunters closing in on a wounded animal. Between them sat Aldrich at the poker table, his hands trembling over the green felt. Every secret he'd buried was about to explode. Henry's voice sliced through the silence. "We built a case so tight, Jeremiah, even the devil couldn't slip out. Bank records, property deeds, bribed officials, forged documents. They spilled the evidence across the table like a blackjack dealer turning over a perfect hand. Each page was a nail in Aldrich's coffin." "This isn't just about you," Philip added. "These papers implicate half the powerful men in Louisiana, men who would tear you apart just to keep their own names clean, turn you over to the feds, leak your crimes to New Orleans society. Either way, you're finished. And we both know it won't be quick." Aldrich's lips barely moved. "What do you want? Money?" His voice was a rasp. Henry leaned in, eyes glittering. "Money? You're broke, Jeremiah. We bought every debt, every loan, every gambling tab you ever signed. We own your plantation. We own your life. You have nothing left except your breath." The air turned ice cold. Even the distant horns on the Mississippi faded. Aldrich sat alone, stripped of power, a king with no crown, surrounded by the sons of the men he'd murdered. Philip let the silence stretch until it snapped. "There is one alternative," he said slowly, savoring each word like a blade twisting. "One way you might keep breathing for now." Henry smiled, a predator who'd waited a decade for this moment. "You're going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah, publicly, legally, permanently. You're going to stand before God and Louisiana society and take your cook, Celeste, as your wife." The demand crashed into Aldrich like a thunderclap. This wasn't just revenge. It was humiliation, destruction, and total domination rolled into one. And the clock on his life had just started ticking. The demand hit Aldrich like a gunshot. "You're going to live as her husband," Philip said, his voice echoing in the cavernous warehouse. "Sleep in her bed. Present yourself to your neighbors as a man who married his own property." Aldrich blinked, his mind rejecting the words. In antebellum Louisiana, such a thing wasn't merely scandalous, it was annihilation, legal suicide, social execution, a humiliation so complete it would make death look merciful. "You're insane," he hissed. "No preacher would perform it, no court would recognize it." Philip cut him off with a smile like a blade. "Actually, we've already made the arrangements. There's a minister in Natchitoches parish neck-deep in gambling debt. He'll sign the papers, perform the vows, and do it all by the book. And Louisiana law, Once that contract is signed, it's binding, for life. Henry leaned in, his eyes burning with a decade's worth of vengeance. The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that it gives you a choice. Refuse. And face immediate consequences for your crimes, consequences far more painful than you can imagine. Accept, and you get to live, but as a public spectacle, a man stripped of his name and dignity, paraded beside the woman he once called property. The warehouse went dead silent again, save for the mournful horns of a ship out on the Mississippi. Aldrich's mind spun. Death would at least leave his reputation intact. His neighbors would never know the truth. But marriage to Celeste, it would destroy everything, his social standing, his legacy, his identity, and leave him alive to suffer it. His voice cracked as he whispered, "How long?" Philip and Henry exchanged a glance, their smiles widening with cold triumph. "For the rest of your natural life, Mr. Aldrich," Philip said. "Marriage is a sacred bond, and given your age and your health, we suspect your natural life might not extend as long as you think." The sound of the river outside seemed to grow louder, like a countdown clock ticking down to his fate. Philip's words landed like a death sentence. "You're going to live as her husband, sleep in her bed, walk into Sunday service with her on your arm, and every neighbor you once fooled will see the truth. Jeremiah Aldrich married his own property." Aldrich froze. In Louisiana high society, this wasn't just scandal, it was obliteration. To marry Celeste meant legal suicide, social exile, a humiliation so deep it made the idea of death almost merciful. "You're insane," he whispered. "No preacher would ever, no court would." "Wrong," Philip snapped. "We've already secured both. A minister in Natchitoches drowning in gambling debt will officiate. Witnesses will sign. And once those vows are spoken, Louisiana law will recognize it as binding, irrevocable, eternal." Henry leaned across the poker table, eyes burning like a predator savoring the kill. "Here's the choice, Jeremiah. Refuse us and the consequences will be immediate and unimaginably painful. Accept and you'll keep your breath, but only to choke on shame. You'll live, but as a living ghost." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the river horns outside seemed to pause, waiting. Aldrich's mind raced. Death meant finality, maybe even dignity. But marriage to Celeste, that was years of torment, each sunrise a reminder that he was trapped in a cage of his own making. Finally he rasped, "How long?" Philip and Henry exchanged a glance that carried 11 years of vengeance. Philip's voice was smooth, merciless. "For the rest of your natural life. Marriage is sacred, Jeremiah, and given your age and your failing health, we suspect that life won't stretch as far as you once dreamed." The Mississippi wind howled through the cracks in the warehouse walls, a chilling reminder. Aldrich wasn't negotiating anymore. He was counting down. The contract was a weapon disguised as paper. Its terms were brutally simple. Aldrich would marry Celeste, legally, publicly, permanently. He would live as her husband, provide for her welfare, and accept her as his equal in the eyes of Louisiana law. In return, his creditors promised only one thing: temporary survival. His hand shook as he signed his name, each stroke of the pen carving his own obituary into history. The moment the ink dried, Aldrich tried to convince himself this was just a pause, a chance to scheme, to flee, to claw back control. Maybe he could slip across state lines, appeal to federal authorities, or find a legal loophole to erase the marriage. But when he looked up, he saw it in Philip and Henry's eyes, cold, knowing triumph. They had been building to this moment for 11 years. Every escape route he imagined they had already sealed. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philip said smoothly, snatching up the contract. "We'll see you tomorrow evening for the ceremony. Wear something appropriate. History will remember this day." The dawn of March 15th, 1854 arrived like a funeral march. The sky sagged with heavy clouds, the humid air reeked of decay from the swamps, and inside Willowbrook Plantation, Jeremiah Aldrich hadn't closed his eyes all night. He spent the dark hours packing his study, staring at the contract that had burned his world to ash. At breakfast, he tried to explain it to Celeste, fumbling through excuses about financial difficulties and social obligations. His words tumbled out like the desperate lies of a drowning man. Celeste listened quietly, her hands folding neatly in her lap. When he finished, she nodded once. "Yes, Master Aldrich, I understand. I'll prepare myself for the ceremony." Her voice was calm, too calm, not resignation, certainty, and that terrified him. It meant she had known, she had expected this. She had been waiting. As Aldrich watched her glide around the kitchen, preparing their last meal as master and slave, a horrifying truth sank in. This wasn't just Philip and Henry's vengeance. Celeste herself had been part of the design, and he was about to walk straight into a ceremony that wasn't a wedding at all. It was an execution of everything he had ever been. The trap had been sprung long before Aldrich realized it. All day, the roads to Willowbrook filled with carriages and riders, neighbors, acquaintances, curious onlookers. They came clutching invitations Aldrich had never written, but which bore his name. Philip and Henry had done it. They had transformed his plantation into a stage for his final humiliation. The word spread fast. Their respectable neighbor, Jeremiah Aldrich, was about to marry one of his slaves. Some believed it was a twisted joke. Others whispered that the financial strain had finally cracked his mind. But when they stepped into the courtyard, they didn't see madness. They saw a wedding. Decorations hung neatly. Refreshments were laid out, and at the center stood Jeremiah Aldrich in his finest coat, sweat dripping beneath his collar, his smile forced so tight it looked like pain carved into flesh. He played his part with desperate energy, parroting the lines Philip had fed him. Christian charity, religious duty, the dignity of elevating a faithful servant. He said it with trembling conviction, praying that if he sold the illusion, he might live another day. Then she appeared, Celeste, not in rags, not in the apron that had defined her bondage for decades, but in a simple, elegant gown that caught the gray light of the overcast sky. At 38, she was no longer young, but her presence was commanding. She walked with poise, with dignity, with something the crowd could not quite name but felt in their bones: authority. Gasps rippled through the guests. A few stifled nervous laughter. Others looked at each other uneasily, unsure whether to sneer or to bow. But when Celeste smiled, when she thanked them for coming, when she declared this the most important day of her life, suddenly the joke felt hollow. The minister, bought and paid for, intoned the vows with mechanical precision. "Speak now, or forever hold your peace." His words hung in the humid air like a dare. Eyes darted around the room, but no one moved. No one was willing to risk being the one to break this uncanny ritual. Aldrich's voice cracked when his turn came. His vows stumbled out in a whisper, barely reaching the first row. But when Celeste spoke, her voice rang strong, clear, steady. She promised to honor and obey, each word a knife twisted into Aldrich's pride. In that moment, the ceremony almost felt ordinary, almost, except everyone knew it was. It was a burial, not of flesh but of reputation. And Jeremiah Aldrich was the corpse being lowered into the grave. The moment everyone had been waiting for and dreading finally came. The minister's voice echoed across the courtyard. "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The crowd froze. Aldrich's face drained of color, sweat streaking down his temples. His body swayed as if his knees might buckle under the weight of humiliation. But then Celeste, his slave, now his wife, lifted him with a single, chilling act of tenderness. She steadied him, rose to her toes, and pressed her lips to his in a brief, chaste kiss. The kiss wasn't passion. It wasn't romance. It was the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut. The guests scattered afterward, muttering in disbelief. Some laughed nervously. Others whispered rumors that would ripple across Louisiana by dawn. But when the last carriage rolled away, Aldrich was left standing inside Willowbrook Plantation, not as its master, but as its prisoner. The house that had once been his pride now felt alien, suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards mocked him. Every shadow seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here anymore." Celeste moved through those rooms with terrifying calm. She rearranged furniture, shifted portraits, repositioned his keepsakes as though wiping his existence off the walls. When Aldrich dared protest, she turned and delivered a single line that broke him more than the kiss ever could. "We're married now, Jeremiah, husband and wife, partners. I think it's time we started acting like it, don't you?" That night in the bed he once called his sanctuary, Aldrich lay stiff and silent beside her. The humiliation cut deeper than any blade. He understood now. Death had been too easy. His enemies hadn't just ended him. They had condemned him to live in a waking nightmare. Because every meal she cooked, every polite smile, every word of affection would carry venom. A slow poison. A reminder that his life was built on blood, and now it was bleeding out drop by drop. But here's the horror Aldrich couldn't yet see. This marriage wasn't the end of Philippe and Henry's revenge. It was only the opening act. The slow torture had just begun. It looked like the marriage was working. To outsiders, Aldrich and Celeste seemed like any other respectable plantation couple in Louisiana. She hosted guests, managed staff, and carried herself with effortless authority, while he forced a smile, pretending life hadn't completely fallen apart. But behind those walls, something was happening. Every morning his coffee tasted just a little bitter. His dinners, though perfectly cooked, left him feeling weak, nauseous, and drained of energy. The headaches started small. Then came the dizziness. And every time he was near Celeste, it seemed to get worse. At first he thought it was just the stress, the shame of being shackled to a wife who was his executioner in disguise. But then, during a meeting with cotton buyers, Aldrich collapsed. That's when Dr. Hamilton Warren, the family physician who had treated him for years, delivered the bombshell. His symptoms weren't from stress. They were the unmistakable signs of arsenic poisoning. The doctor's words were a death sentence. "Mr. Aldrich, without immediate treatment and removal from the source, this is fatal." In that moment, Aldrich realized the horrifying truth. His wife wasn't just punishing him. She was killing him slowly, drop by drop, meal by meal. Celeste wasn't just his wife. She was the executioner in his own bed. Celeste's plan was diabolical. She wasn't killing Aldrich in one swift strike. She was engineering a death so slow, so subtle that to anyone else it would look perfectly natural. But Aldrich wasn't blind, he knew, and that knowledge was a curse. Confronting her would be suicide. She had everything the law on her side as his wife, her innocent mask of devotion and the backing of Philippe and Henry, the two men who controlled his every breath. If he dared accuse her, she could laugh it off, and they would make sure he paid the price for such delusions. So he went underground. Aldrich began living like a hunted man inside his own home. He cooked his meals in secret, with ingredients no one else touched, using pots and pans he hid in his study like contraband. He drank only from a private well, terrified of every cup she offered. At night, he abandoned the marital bed, locking himself away in a guest room, his fortress against a woman who smiled by day and poisoned by night. For a moment it worked. His symptoms slowed, but his precautions sparked a new, more dangerous problem: exposure. The neighbors noticed. His skin grew pale, his body thin, his movements jittery. At dinners he flinched from food and wine, his eyes darting, his hands trembling. Soon, whispers spread across Louisiana society: Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't poisoned. He was mad. And Celeste played her role flawlessly. To visitors, she was the picture of a loving wife. She served lavish meals, only to watch her husband push them away with trembling suspicion. She poured wine with care, only for him to refuse with shaking hands. And when they asked, she sighed with the soft ache of a devoted woman watching her husband slip into madness. Her genius was simple: the more he protected himself, the more insane he looked. His caution was turned into paranoia, his survival instincts painted as delusion, and little by little, society believed her story, not his. Aldrich wasn't just being poisoned in body. He was being poisoned in reputation, in sanity, in every trace of dignity he had left. By the spring of 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich was living in a prison without walls. Every day he felt the poison eating him alive. His stomach twisted, his head spun, his nerves fired like broken wires. And yet when he cried for help, no one listened. Dr. Warren, his neighbors, his oldest associates, all of them dismissed his warnings as madness. Why? Because the story sounded too impossible to believe. Who could imagine that a woman once enslaved could mastermind such a complex scientific murder? Who would dare believe she had the knowledge, the patience, the sheer brilliance to pull it off? So when Aldrich begged for help, people shook their heads with pity. They didn't see a man fighting for his life. They saw a broken aristocrat unraveling under the weight of humiliation. And that was the cruelest twist of all. The more he spoke the truth, the deeper he sank into the image of a lunatic. But his tormentors weren't finished. No, Philippe and Henry hadn't designed this revenge to merely kill Aldrich. They wanted to erase him, to strip away his reputation, his friendships, his very identity until nothing remained but a husk waiting for death. And the final act of their performance was about to begin. It happened during a glittering dinner party at Willowbrook, the 3-month anniversary of his marriage. Celeste played her role flawlessly, smiling as she welcomed neighbors, Dr. Warren, and the few society figures who still dared to associate with the disgraced plantation owner. Aldrich spent the entire day preparing in secret. He ate beforehand. He vowed he wouldn't touch a crumb of the food she served. He had a plan to outlast her game. But Celeste had a plan of her own. Halfway through the evening, she rose from her chair, her voice clear and sweet. "Tonight," she announced, "I have a surprise." From the cellar she brought forth a bottle of wine, ancient, dust-covered, supposedly preserved from before their marriage. A symbol, she said, of tradition, of endurance, of their future together. And she made sure everyone watched as it was opened. No tricks, no tampering, just a public display of trust. Glass after glass was poured in front of the guests, and every eye in the room turned to Aldrich. Would he drink? If he refused, he confirmed their suspicions, that he was insane, paranoid, broken. If he drank, he might be sealing his own death. This was no toast. This was the trap. They passed the glasses in plain sight, polished, tipped, and offered to every guest so that nothing could be blamed on tampering. Celeste lifted her own goblet, smiling as she proposed a toast to our marriage and many happy years. The room clinked. Faces watched. Aldrich felt the net tighten around his neck. He couldn't refuse. To balk now would be madness, an open, public confirmation that he'd lost his mind. So he raised the glass, watched the rim glitter in the lamplight, and caught Celeste's eyes across the table. For a single heartbeat, her devoted mask slotted, and he saw it. A flash of cold triumph, the look of someone who had rehearsed this moment for a lifetime. By the time realization crawled into his skull, it was already too late. The poison hit fast. Minutes, not hours. A knife of cramps tore through his gut, his breathing fought against invisible chains. A burning crawled from throat to chest. Aldrich lurched forward, hands clawing at the table, silverware clattering like tiny alarms. The guests shrank back, murmurs swelling into panic. Dr. Warren lunged to help, but Celeste turned the scene into performance art. She flung herself across her husband, sobbing, keening, begging the doctor to save him, while subtly blocking any effective treatment. Her grief was too perfect, too theatrical. The other guests clustered around her, consoling the devoted wife, while the man they had once envied convulsed on his own floor. And as Aldrich slid toward unconsciousness, Celeste bent down and whispered into his ear, a whisper that detonated the last of his defenses. Marcus Devo was my cousin, she breathed. Samuel Rochelle, my uncle by marriage. We've been working together since 1845. We waited for the night you drink. We wanted you to die the way you made them die, slow, alone, and in terror. The words were a cold blade. The horror wasn't just that he was being killed. It was that the woman who had shared his bed, who had served him for 7 years, was not a hired actor in someone else's war. She was the war, personal, patient, unforgiving. As the room blurred and the world narrowed to the sound of his own ragged breaths, Aldrich understood the full scope of the conspiracy. Every meal, every smile, every small accident had been rehearsal for this final act. He had not been humiliated by strangers. He had been curated into his own execution. Outside, the river fog pressed against the windows like a witness. Inside, men and women whispered about madness and misfortune. But the last thing Aldrich heard before the light went was Celeste's voice, low and calm. We did what you did. We returned your currency. We returned your name to the dead. Then everything went black. The room buzzed with panic, but none of it was for the truth. As Jeremiah Aldrich gasped his last breaths, Celeste's voice cut through the chaos like a stage actor playing her greatest role. She begged Dr. Warren to save him, wept to God for mercy, and collapsed against her husband's twitching body as though her soul were shattering. The neighbors rushed to console her, blind to the performance. They weren't watching a murder. They thought they were watching a tragedy. At 9:47 p.m., June 18, 1854, Jeremiah Aldrich died in front of a room full of witnesses who believed they had just seen the final collapse of a broken man. Dr. Warren signed the death certificate, natural causes associated with prolonged nervous exhaustion. A tidy explanation, clean, final, and completely wrong. The funeral days later was packed. Neighbors whispered about madness, misfortune, and God's mysterious punishments. And there stood Celeste, the grieving widow, delivering such a flawless performance that wealthy plantation ladies offered to help her manage Willowbrook while she mourned. None suspected that behind those tears, she was savoring victory. But Philip and Henry weren't done. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about dismantling Aldrich's legacy brick by brick. Within weeks, Celeste, now his legal heir, signed over Willowbrook to the same men who had orchestrated her husband's destruction, trading away the plantation for relief from debts she never truly owed. The deal left her free, wealthy enough to vanish north, her past swallowed by distance and silence. And just like that, one of the most elaborate revenge plots in Louisiana's history ended not with scandal but with silence. No trials, no rumors, no suspicions. To the world, Aldrich was simply another fallen planter swallowed by bad luck and worse health. But those who knew, the three who had woven this plan since 1845, understood the truth. Jeremiah Aldrich's empire wasn't just stolen. It was inverted, poisoned, and consumed from the inside out. And Celeste, the woman who once scrubbed his floors, walked away not as his property, but as the final weapon that ended him. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their revenge was its invisibility. To the outside world, Jeremiah Aldrich's death was a footnote, a curious tale of a wealthy man undone by financial stress and eccentric choices. To historians, it was just another plantation tragedy swallowed by the fog of the 1850s. But in the hidden corners of New Orleans parlors and behind shuttered windows in Louisiana's parishes, another story traveled. The real story. A whispered legend of a conspiracy so patient, so meticulous, it spanned 11 years. A tale of vengeance engineered with such precision that it delivered punishment equal to the crime, slow, merciless, and absolute. Philippe Deveau and Henry Rochelle had done the impossible. They tried a murderer in a court that never existed. They passed a death sentence no judge would sign, and they executed it in plain sight, leaving no trail, no evidence, nothing but silence. Their brilliance lay not just in the cruelty of their design, but in their mastery of Louisiana's society itself. They understood how money, reputation, and appearances could shield them better than any weapon. And in the ashes of Aldrich's empire, they built something he would have found more horrifying than death itself. Willowbrook Plantation, the jewel of Aldrich's bloody fortune, was reborn as a refuge for freedmen and the escaped. By day, it looked like a working estate under new management, but by night, it became a link in the Underground Railroad, funneling enslaved souls toward the freedom Aldrich had once denied them. The great house that had hosted Louisiana's most powerful men now sheltered fugitives. The same halls where Aldrich plotted his profits now echoed with whispered prayers of those fleeing bondage. His land, his legacy, his very name, twisted against him, weaponized into a tool for liberation. That was the true genius of Philip and Henry's revenge, not just the destruction of a man, but the transformation of his empire into its opposite. His wealth became the fuel of freedom, his house a sanctuary, his memory a warning whispered for generations. Never betray men who can outwait your lifetime. Never underestimate the reach of revenge. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't just killed, he was deleted. His fortune stolen back and given to the families he destroyed. His grand estate turned into a weapon against slavery itself. His name dissolved into whispers and footnotes, remembered only as a cautionary tale of a man who thought he was untouchable. And that's the cruelest justice of all. Not a violent death, not a courtroom sentence, but being erased so completely that history itself forgot he ever lived. This story proves that sometimes justice doesn't wear robes or swing a gavel. Sometimes it hides in the shadows, patient, relentless, and merciless. So I'll leave you with this question. Was Jeremiah Aldrich truly murdered, or was he finally judged? If this story gripped you, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and share it with someone who loves chilling mysteries. Because trust me, what I have coming next will be even darker,